Hello, everyone. I'm Diane Larson, a board member of the IAASB, and I'll be our moderator today as we take a deep dive into the very important topic of assurance on sustainability reporting. In our time together, we'll be going through some of the key elements of a sustainability assurance engagement and discuss how the proposed ISSA 5000 standard will address them. For our discussion, we've assembled a great bunch of speakers. And Michelle, if you move forward a slide. What we'll do is we'll start off by setting the stage. I'll ask Tom Seidenstein, the chair of the IAASB, to provide an overall introduction into the proposed standard, how it's structured, what the key objectives are, and so on. Next, we'll hear from Dan Montgomery, who will start us on our path of going a bit deeper into ISSA 5000 by covering key principles, concepts, and definitions. After Dan, we'll turn it to Susan Jones to take on materiality, risk, and response, more important topics that are obviously key to any assurance engagement. And then we'll turn it to Claire Grayson to round out our discussion by addressing misstatements, other information, communication, and reporting. I'll come back at the end and talk briefly about other outreach plans we expect to complete. Throughout this discussion, if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A. I'll be keeping a lookout for them, and during the discussion points, I'll pause to address questions as appropriate. So let's get started and kick off with Tom providing an overall introduction. Tom, over to you.
Thank you, Diane. And first of all, thank you to everyone who's joining this webinar. It's a real honor to have you here, and we hope that you'll be an active participant in our consultation process. So why are we here? The IAASB has prioritized its completion of ISSA 5000 as a standalone end-to-end sustainability-specific standard. And the reason we prioritize this is because we have a few core beliefs that users of sustainability information will benefit from: one, external assurance provided by independent professionals committed to a high level of ethical standards. Two, that there's a need for a global baseline developed in a robust and transparent manner. This is just as important on the assurance side as it is on the reporting side. And thirdly, that we should have an assurance framework that builds upon well-tested practices already in place in the market. We also are living in the world of practicalities, and we are aware that in many jurisdictions there are timelines already in place for requirements, and it was for this reason that we moved very quickly but thoughtfully to publish a proposal. And it's at this point we really need your input to make it better. So I think our long-term goal, if you flip the slide, is to make our sustainability assurance at a level in terms of quality and confidence to where we are on financial audits. But at the same time, we have to recognize that it probably will not happen overnight. So where are we as a board? We're entirely committed to having a complete standard in place by the end of 2024. We believe this will be a significant step forward over existing standards in terms of quality. That's because we are adding a levels of specificity over our existing assurance standards as it relates to sustainability information. So let me give you a little bit of an idea of what we're trying to do in this standard and where we're going to go in the future. So proposed ISSA 5000 is general requirements for sustainability assurance engagements is an overarching standard for sustainability. It covers the entire engagement from engagement acceptance to reporting. At the same time, you have to understand that we can't do it all at once. It's not going to be the same level of detail as we have on the audit side for financial audits. So we're going to focus on the end-to-end requirements, but maybe go deeper in future standards along the way. So having a global baseline for a suite of sustainability standards will allow us to deal with the general engagement now, but we may go into specific topics such as biodiversity or specific elements of an engagement, such as materiality, in more detail at a later date. One of the things to know is that in our proposal, we also have asked a question on what topics we should address at a future date, and we hope that you will comment on it. Next slide, please. To get this standard done by 2024, and also reflecting the comments we've heard in the marketplace, we've taken some elements of all of that into our design principles. So a big element to know is that the standard is suitable for use for all sustainability topics and information disclosed about these topics. It is an entirely standalone standard. You will not need to refer back to ISA 3000 or 3410 in its application. The overarching standard also accommodates additional reporting requirements in specific jurisdictions, such as electronic tagging or specific compliance requirements to be reported in conjunction with assurance on sustainability information. One thing we've heard repeatedly from regulators and other policymakers that we need to make this standard profession agnostic. That means it's relevant to both professional accountants and non-accountant insurance practitioners. And that means that anyone could use it provided they fulfill the requirements of the standards. It addresses both limited and reasonable assurance. And going back to the profession agnostic stuff, it relies upon practitioners being committed to the use of a robust ethical standards as demanded as the ISSA code, and commitment to quality management standards as demanded as ISQM1. Finally, we're developing this standard in a principle-based way. We're providing sufficient specificity to derive consistency of the conduct of sustainability assurance engagements for all entities, regardless of size and complexity. And we hope that it will be robust enough to address the challenges in addressing these and conducting these engagements. Clearly, this is a point on which we're going to seek your input. Have we got the balance right between principle-based and enough guidance to allow you to perform such an engagement? So I hope that gives you a sense of where we are today, and I look forward to getting your comments throughout this webinar.
Great. Thanks so much, Tom, for setting the stage. Now, Michelle, if you don't mind, just flip to the next slide. Now it's time to get into some of the details. And for this, I'm going to start off with Dan Montgomery. And for Dan, I'm going to turn it over to you to discuss some key subjects that I know as a board member, we spend an awful lot of time talking about, namely these key principles, concepts, and definitions, which are really critically important to get solid before you embark on these engagements. So Dan, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Diane. And yeah, you're right. The board did spend a lot of time on these concepts and definitions. And anyone that's looked at the exposure draft can see readily that there's no shortage of terminology and definitions there. So where I'd like to start in trying to provide a high-level overview of some of these important concepts is to say that, like ISA 3000, ISSA 5000 addresses the key elements of an assurance engagement. So parties involved, the criteria that will be used, the information to be reported, obtaining evidence, and providing a written conclusion. So in this part of the webinar, I'll just touch on a few key principles and concepts that are specific to ISSA 5000 and sustainability assurance. So as you can see on this slide, we're going to start with some of the key terminology. And the best place to start is with three important definitions. That's sustainability matters, sustainability information, and disclosures. I would point you to Appendix 1 of ISSA 5000, which explains the relationship of these terms. So the IAASB acknowledged that it was important to have a clear and consistent understanding of how these terms are used in the proposed standard, but defining them was no easy task because they are used in and described in different ways in reporting frameworks and standards and other sources. So the IAASB kind of followed two key principles, if you will, foundational. One is they have to be framework neutral, and consistent with other IAASB assurance standards. I'll also mention that we've been coordinating along the way with our colleagues at ISSA to align the terminology as closely as possible with their proposals. So let's start on the right-hand side here and first look at sustainability information. That's the information that an entity would present through some kind of reporting mechanism, sustainability report, integrated report, part of an annual report, or something else. And the IAASB wanted a definition of sustainability information that was as straightforward as possible. So in simplest terms, it's information about sustainability matters. And that's the core of the definition. And for you technically minded folks, that's also what's known in other assurance standards as subject matter information. So what do we exactly mean by sustainability matters? The sustainability matters can cover a wide range of environmental, social, economic, and cultural topics. And the information provided by the entity can address different aspects of those topics. There's a few examples on the slide here, and you can see a more detailed list in paragraph 832 of the exposure draft. The definition of sustainability matters was intended to be as broad as possible to reflect the current sustainability reporting environment and includes a reference to impacts of the entity on the environment and vice versa, kind of the notion of double materiality, which we'll come back to in just a bit. The last key term here is disclosures, and ISSA 5000 defines them as specific information related to an aspect of a topic. It's worth noting that as a practical matter, any information about an aspect of a topic also relates to a topic. So don't be alarmed if you see references to both topics and aspects of topics in ISSA 5000. And as you'll see a little bit later, disclosures are an important concept in the proposed standard in terms of planning, risk assessment, and response. Well, let's move to the next slide and explore another key concept of an insurance engagement, and certainly a key concept in ISSA 5000, that's criteria. Start on the left-hand side this time. Those are the benchmarks that are used to measure or evaluate the sustainability matters. And the most common reference throughout the standard will be to applicable criteria. The suitability of criteria is an important part of accepting or continuing an assurance engagement, as we know. And as mentioned, ED 5000 has been developed to be framework neutral. So it can be used for assurance on all kinds of sustainability information using any suitable criteria, whether it's framework criteria, entity developed, or a combination of both. And we know the reporting framework, reporting landscape is rapidly evolving, frameworks and other criteria being developed, and mandatory reporting is being introduced in many jurisdictions. So as noted, the standard is framework neutral, as are all IAASB standards, but the board has looked at the landscape of different reporting standards and key jurisdictional reporting requirements. Hopefully you'll see that some of the concepts in ISSA 5000 are indeed consistent with those standards. The reporting framework or other criteria really drive the selection of the matters to be disclosed by the entity. So management, in the first instance, has the primary responsibility for determining the topics and aspects of topics and how they will be presented. And that's referred to in lots of different ways, the materiality process, materiality assessment, or other terms. I do want to touch briefly now on the concept of double materiality, because the reporting framework may require the application of that concept, and that recognizes that the information needs of intended users may relate to both the impact of matters on the entity or the impacts of the entity on the environment or society, the economy. So either financial materiality or impact materiality or both. It's important to note that management's materiality process is not the same or is different from the practitioner's materiality. And we'll touch on materiality in a little bit. But when required, the practitioner will apply kind of the double materiality lens, if you will, in making materiality judgments, including when evaluating the effect of uncorrected misstatements. So a couple of final points on this slide. The sustainability matters are measured or evaluated against the criteria that results in the sustainability information. There's also a reference to assertions here. So I just wanted to highlight that that's a key concept in ISSA 5000, and it's a reminder that assertions are linked to disclosures. So let's move to the next slide. And we're going to start on the right-hand side again. That brings us to another key concept in an ISSA 5000, and that's the scope of the engagement. As explained in paragraph 4 of ISSA 5000, the scope may extend to all of the information expected to be reported or only part of it. It's an important part of engagement acceptance and continuance procedures to obtain a preliminary knowledge of what information is expected to be reported, and then the practitioner can go on and agree with management on what's to be included in the scope of the engagement. Now, I want to mention that the IAASB considered whether separate terms might be useful to clarify the difference between the information reported by the entity, the entirety, and the information that's subject to the assurance engagement, but concluded that having separate terms would just be too complex. And it was noted that ISAE 3410 already notes that not all the information being reported may be subject to assurance. So paragraph 4 does explain that when the assurance engagement doesn't cover the entirety of the information reported, the term sustainability information is to be read as that which is subject to the assurance engagement. So in broadest terms, anything else that's reported but not subject to the assurance engagement is other information. That's not really the technical definition of other information, but I'll leave that to Claire to talk about a little bit more later. The scope of the engagement, including whether the practitioner will issue a conclusion on the entirety of what's reported or separate conclusions for different disclosures, affects a number of different aspects of the engagement, including materiality, risk procedures, further procedures, and evaluating misstatements, and ultimately reporting, of course. You'll also see a reference to greenhouse gas statements there with a question mark. We recognize there's likely to be questions coming in about the relationship of ISSA 5000 and 3410. For now, all I'm going to say is that paragraph 19 of the explanatory memorandum indicates that the IAASB noted that just the need for a clear and straightforward approach regarding the relationship of those two standards, recognizing that in many cases a greenhouse gas statement may be included as a part of the sustainability information, and the practitioner may or may not be providing a separate conclusion on the statement. So the IAASB concluded that 5000 should apply to all assurance engagements on sustainability information, except when the practitioner is providing a separate conclusion on a greenhouse gas statement. And in that case, ISAE 3410 applies. You see that in paragraph 2 of the proposed standard. Once the scope of the engagement is known, the practitioner can then start thinking about the approach to the engagement, including the engagement team and other resources that might be needed. So if we go to the next slide, talk about really another very important concept in the standard that affects a number of different requirements, and there's some very important application material in the standard that deals with these requirements. Sustainability assurance engagements, of course, may cover a wide range of sustainability matters, And some may require specialized skills and knowledge beyond those that are possessed by the engagement leader and the other members of the engagement team. And that might necessitate using the work of an expert, a practitioner's expert. And that expert can be either internal, and by definition, an internal expert is a member of the engagement team, or it could be an external expert. By definition in the standard, external experts are not members of the engagement team. In addition, the sustainability information that's subject to the engagement may include information for numerous entities within the organizational boundary or for entities up and down the value chain. And in those circumstances, the engagement team may seek to use the work of other assurance practitioners, which may be from a firm other than the practitioner's firm. And that work also may be yet to be performed and could be performed as a part of the broader sustainability engagement, or may have already been performed for another purpose. So ISSA 5000 needed to accommodate all of these different scenarios, and those are depicted here on this slide. This diagram should be familiar if you've read the explanatory memorandum, because it's reproduced from paragraph 87 in the EM. It's a visual illustration of the individuals that may be involved and the requirements in ISSA 5000 that apply to the work of these various individuals. It's paragraphs 82 to 83 of the EM explanatory memo that I'd point you to. It describes it in more detail. So I'm only going to touch on a couple of important points here. First, starting with some of the important engagement quality management principles in ISSA 5000. First is that the engagement leader has overall responsibility for managing and achieving quality on the engagement, and that includes being sufficiently and appropriately involved throughout. Secondly, the engagement leader takes overall responsibility for direction and supervision of members of the engagement team and the review of their work. And then related, but lastly, if the practitioner intends to use the work of an external expert or a firm other than the practitioner's own firm, it's important for the engagement leader to determine whether there's an ability to be sufficiently and appropriately involved in that work, just as you would for members of the engagement team from the practitioner's own firm. So as you can see from this diagram, the requirements in ISSA 5000 are based on an expectation that the practitioner is able to be sufficiently and appropriately involved in the work. This might include individuals from other firms or either within or outside of the practitioner firm's network. When those individuals perform procedures on the engagement and the practitioner is able to direct and supervise them and review their work. So that's really the bottom row and the middle column, which would treat those folks as any other, just like any other member of the engagement team. And the requirements with respect to direction, supervision, and review would apply. When another firm performs assurance work and the practitioner is unable to direct, supervise, and review that work, such firms and the individuals from those firms who performed the work are not members of the engagement team and are referred to in ISSA 5000 as another practitioner. So that's the bottom right box on this slide. And in those circumstances, it may still be possible to use the work of another practitioner. Paragraphs 51 to 54, the requirements in the standard, walk the practitioner through the steps required to make that determination and whether the work will be adequate for purposes of the sustainability assurance engagement. So Diane, that is really a quick flyby of some very important concepts in ISSA 5000. I'm going to stop there, and I guess we'll see if there are any questions that have come up that we might be able to respond to.
Yep. Thanks so much, Dan. And, I encourage folks to go back and look at that chart that we had that kind of did a nice outline of all the definitions. Shockingly, Dan, we have not gotten a ton of questions on definitions, so you might be off the hook temporarily. But I do want to come back to a couple things, and some of this reflects back on Tom's tee up about the concept of this being an overarching standard. I'll call it some housekeeping to square back on, which is the EER that's out there today. And you mentioned 3410, Dan, but also 3000. So maybe I'll just open up to the panelists. So once ISSA 5000 comes out, can practitioners continue to use 3000? And then what's the future of the EER? So I'll open it up to see who wants to answer this one.
Well, thanks, Diane. Maybe I will certainly start. And Tom, if he wants to come in, or Diane, if you want to say anything about it, please feel free. Let's start with the EER guidance. As we know, that is a guidance that has been used and widely accepted by practitioners as being very helpful. It's non-authoritative in nature, so it will continue to sit out there as non-authoritative guidance. And the IAASB hasn't made any decisions as of yet in terms of what might happen down the road to that guidance. But for now, it's still very valuable authoritative guidance as it relates to basically extended external reporting assurance engagements. So they'll leave it at that for EER. For 3000, obviously, that's the core assurance standard of the board, and will continue to apply for assurance engagements on a variety of topics, other than engagements relating to sustainability information, in which obviously ISSA 5000 would apply to those engagements. And as I mentioned, if there's a separate conclusion that's being expressed on a greenhouse gas statement, then ISA 3410 would apply in terms of the procedures for supporting that separate conclusion. I might add, Diane, just for now on 3410, that as we all know, the board had a number of discussions about the relationship between 3410 and 5000, including should there be more detail in 5000 on the relationship, and what happens if it's only a greenhouse gas statement that's presented and the conclusion expressed, or what happens if it's a greenhouse gas statement is a part of it, and what if it's only a little bit, or it started to get very complex in a hurry in terms of the landscape and the different permutations, and what's what's the threshold for when one standard would apply or not. And it kept coming back to, we need to recognize that 5000 is the primary standard for assurance on sustainability information, and that's why the scope was set up the way it was.
Yeah, you're spot on. I mean, we did go round and round on that 3410, and as you mentioned earlier, that is included as a specific question in the EM, looking for folks' feedback as to whether we've got it right or what they want to see. One of the questions that we did grapple quite a bit with is scalability. Now, obviously, the standard, I think of scalability in a couple ways. The standard is designed to cover both reasonable and limited assurance engagements, but beyond that, these engagements will vary significantly to maybe opining on one item of disclosure to a full gamut of disclosures, qualitative and quantitative, and just a variety of topics, as Dan walked us through the definitions. So maybe, again, I'll throw it back to the panelists to give a little color perhaps to the audience about how we dealt with scalability, which again was, we tried to stay true to that, but there were some challenges along the way, but maybe just talk about scalability. I don't know who wants to take that one.
I can give it.
Sure, Claire, yeah.
A go, Diane, for sure. And essentially, sorry, my video is not on. Essentially, you know, the board and staff, you know, challenged as we were drafting all of the requirements to really think whether they'd be applicable to all range of engagements, whether it's on a specific target or metric, or whether it's on an entire sustainability report, and look and certainly scalability in terms of the size of the entity as well. And very much this standard has been written throughout as a principle-based standard, so that we are not trying to include, we tried very hard not to include requirements that would be specific to larger entities or more complex entities, but to be able to be tailored. And using that principle-based approach allows the practitioner to exercise their professional judgment in order to determine the depth and the nature and extent of the procedures that they'll conduct, you know, to get the evidence they need. So, and I'm sure Susan's going to touch on that more in the next segment. But you won't find a lot of requirements that are specifically say that they're scalable for less complex and more complex entities, because we very much challenged that as we went along to make sure that they would apply in almost every instance.
Right. Thanks, Claire. And I think folks will see that in ISSA 5000, we have obviously included application material, and where appropriate, we tried to weave in some examples to give a little bit more context as you think about applying the requirement to these different sized engagements and entities. So thanks for that feedback on the scalability. So we're going to mush ahead. We're going to continue to get deeper into some of the key concepts within the proposed standard. And for that, I'm going to turn to Susan Jones. I'm going to ask her to talk about some more exciting topics: materiality, risk, and response. Again, really critical to these types of engagements. So Susan, I will turn it over to you to take us through these three topics. Thank you.
Thanks, Diane, and thanks for the sales pitch about how exciting this is going to be. I'm Susan Jones, and I'm here to present to you the highlights of the risk and response section of the exposure draft. So Michelle, if we can go to the next slide. Okay, so first let's focus a little bit on materiality. Materiality is a matter of judgment, and it's based on the practice. A misstatement is material if it would influence, or the practitioner believes it would influence, the decisions of users. So we did hear from outreach that the concept of materiality and sustainability reporting is very challenging, but it's also important to stakeholders, the entity, and the practitioner. The challenges arise from the fact that, unlike financial statements, which are reported in a single currency unit, sustainability information may be measured in different units. For example, a sustainability report could include, among other things, carbon dioxide emissions measured in tons and safety violations measured in numbers of instances. Furthermore, sustainability information often includes qualitative disclosures, for example, descriptions of processes. So the different measurement units make it difficult to determine materiality for sustainability information as a whole. So the board has decided that materiality would be considered or determined for each disclosure, not necessarily for the information as a whole. It's also more challenging to determine materiality when planning and performing an engagement for qualitative disclosures. It's difficult to assign a number to a qualitative disclosure, but we did hear on outreach that practitioners do apply the concept of materiality to the evaluation of misstatements identified in qualitative disclosures. So they'll identify a misstatement in a qualitative disclosure, and they'll think, well, would that misstatement influence a decision of a user? So the IAASB and the proposed ISSA requires the practitioner in planning and performing the engagement to, for quantitative disclosures, determine materiality and also to determine performance materiality to deal with the concept of aggregation risk. And this is consistent with the requirements in ISAE 3410. And then for qualitative disclosures, the practitioner would consider, not determine, but consider materiality. Now, I want to point out that some criteria may use the word materiality or material in describing the process that the entity uses to identify information that is relevant to users and that would be included in the report or in the sustainability information. And understanding management's materiality process may be useful to the practitioner, but that process, as contemplated by the criteria, is different than the practitioner's consideration of materiality. Management's materiality process is focusing on the information that is relevant to intended users, and the practitioner's consideration of materiality is focused on whether a misstatement is material, that is, whether it would reasonably be affected to influence the decisions of users. So anyway, next slide. Now that we've covered off materiality, I want to focus a little bit on risk. So to identify risks, the practitioner must first obtain an understanding of the entity, its environment, the applicable criteria, and the entity's system of internal control. So is there a difference in understanding the required between reasonable and limited assurance engagements? And the proposed standard does have a differentiation in both the extent of the understanding that is required and what the practitioner is required to understand. So in terms of the extent of understanding, that is indicated by the purpose of the understanding. So in a limited assurance engagement, the purpose of the understanding is to identify disclosures in the sustainability information where material misstatements are likely to arise and to design procedures to focus on those disclosures. So in a limited assurance engagement, the practitioner is focused focuses procedures on riskier disclosures at the disclosure level. In a reasonable assurance engagement, the purpose of the understanding is to identify and assess the risks of material misstatement at the assertion level for the disclosures and design further procedures. And so Dan touched briefly on assertions, and I think we're going to be talking about them later, but assertions would include, among other things, the completeness or occurrence of the disclosure or its accuracy, quantification, classification. There's a more complete list in the proposed standard, but it's important to recognize that in a reasonable assurance engagement, it's more granular focus on the risk of material misstatement at the assertion level rather than the disclosure level. Okay, next slide, please, Michelle. Thank you. So next, we're going to get to the understanding of the entity's components of internal control. So there is a differentiation in the standard between limited and reasonable assurance related to the required understanding of the entity's system of internal control. So we have the 5 components of the system of internal control. And when we're speaking about the extent of the understanding of the components of internal control, in a reasonable assurance engagement, the practitioner is required to understand that component and then evaluate it. In a limited assurance engagement, the practitioner is required to understand the components, but is not required to evaluate those components. So that goes to the extent of the understanding. Now, what is the practitioner required to understand? And that's slightly different too. So in all cases, both reasonable and limited assurance, the board believes it is important for the practitioner to understand the entity's control environment and the entity's information system relevant to the sustainability information. So those are both required. Understanding is both required. For risk assessment and monitoring components, so with respect to those components, the board believes that understanding those processes may go beyond what is appropriate for a limited assurance engagement. So understanding those processes is not required for a limited assurance engagement. However, understanding the results of the entity's risk assessment process may be helpful to the practitioner in identifying disclosures where material misstatements are likely to arise in a limited assurance engagement. Therefore, the proposed standard requires an understanding of the results of the entity's risk assessment process in a limited assurance engagement. Now, with respect to control activities, In a reasonable assurance engagement, the practitioner is required to understand the control activities component. And understanding the control activities component includes understanding those controls that the practitioner intends to test the operating effectiveness of to obtain evidence, any related general IT controls that is related to those controls in the first bullet that the practitioner is required to understand, and any other controls that the practitioner judges necessary to identify risks or design further procedures. And understanding a control means evaluating the design of the control and determining whether it has been implemented. In both limited and reasonable assurance engagements, if the practitioner plans to test operating effectiveness of a control to obtain evidence, the practitioner is required to understand the control and any related general IT controls, because it doesn't make any sense to test an operating effectiveness of a control without understanding whether it has been designed effectively and implemented. Next slide, please, Michelle. So now we can get to the responses to risks, and that is, so the practitioner in both limited and reasonable assurance engagements are design and perform procedures that in a limited assurance engagement are focused on those disclosures in the sustainability information where material misstatements are likely to arise, or are responsive to the risk of material misstatement at the assertion level for disclosure in a reasonable assurance engagement. So that links back to the purpose of the understanding that we had earlier. So in their toolkit, in designing these responses, the practitioner has tests of controls, which they would only do if they have obtained an understanding of those controls and plan to obtain evidence about their operating effectiveness. Otherwise, you wouldn't bother testing controls. Or the practitioner may perform substantive procedures. Now, sometimes the practitioner may identify conditions that indicate that misstatements may occur pervasively throughout the sustainability information. So they're overall risks, and that would require overall responses. And these conditions may include a deficient control environment, or identified or suspected fraud or noncompliance with laws or regulations, or a situation where misstatements are just popping out all over the place. The practitioner has identified misstatements throughout the sustainability information. In these cases, the practitioner would implement overall responses, which may include things like closer direction, supervision, and review of staff, or calling in more experienced staff, more procedures conducted at the period end rather than during an interim date, added element of unpredictability in testing, or an increase in the extent of procedures. Next slide, please, Michelle. So if the practitioner is performing a limited assurance engagement, the goal of that is to be able to report whether a matter has come to the practitioner's attention to cause the practitioner to believe that the sustainability information is not prepared or fairly presented in all material respects in accordance with the applicable criteria. So when the practitioner is focusing in the limited assurance engagement on disclosures where the material misstatements are more likely to arise, the practitioner may identify matters that do cause them to believe that there may be a misstatement. And when this happens, the practitioner performs what we have been calling the deep dive, which is why I have a picture of a diver on this slide. And in this case, the practitioner needs to just keep on going and perform additional procedures on those disclosures until the practitioner has concluded that the information is not likely to be misstated or determined that in fact it is misstated. And if the practitioner cannot come to either of these conclusions, then there is a scope limitation and the practitioner cannot issue an unmodified conclusion. Okay, next slide, please, Michelle. All right. And then there's also some guidance in our response to risks about analytical procedures. So the standard does contemplate the use of analytical procedures. And when performing analytical procedures, the practitioner is required to develop an expectation about a recorded quantity or a ratio, but the expectation is required to be more precise in a reasonable assurance engagement than in a limited assurance engagement. There's also a fair amount on estimates and forward-looking information. We did hear on outreach that forward-looking information and estimates are common in sustainability information and that guidance is needed. So forward-looking information may include forecasts, projections, information about future risks and opportunities, for example, disclosures associated with transition to net zero. But both forward-looking information and estimates have a degree of uncertainty and judgment. Regardless of the source or degree of uncertainty or the extent of judgment involved, it is necessary for management to appropriately apply the applicable criteria and to select and use appropriate methods, assumption, and data. So when developing the estimates and forward-looking information and the related disclosures, therefore, the IAASB concluded that most appropriate approach in this standard would be to address estimates and forward-looking information together in the responding to risks and material misstatements section of the exposure draft. Now, previously mentioned, Dan mentioned that there would be likely additional standards developed under this ISSA 5000, and there may be one specifically related to estimates and forward-looking information, and then that would be teased out a little more thoroughly. The proposed standard also differentiates between the work effort required in a limited assurance versus a reasonable assurance engagement. In a limited assurance engagement, the practitioner evaluates management's application of the criteria, the methods for developing estimates or forward-looking information, and the appropriateness of changes from the prior period in estimates. The practitioner then considers whether additional procedures are necessary. In a reasonable assurance engagement, the practitioner may test how management developed an estimate or forward-looking information, including evaluating the methods, assumption, and data, or the practitioner may develop a point estimate or range to evaluate management's disclosure, or the practitioner may obtain evidence from events occurring up to the date of the practitioner's report. Okay, final slide, Michelle, for me. The standard also tries to incorporate the concepts of professional skepticism, and particularly with respect to fraud, throughout the standard. So it includes requirements related to this maintenance of professional skepticism, including a discussion amongst the engagement team about the susceptibility of disclosures to material misstatement, whether due to fraud or error. It includes designing and performing procedures in an unbiased manner to meet the purpose of the procedures. It includes resolving any doubts about the relevance and reliability of information to be used as evidence, and if those doubts cannot be resolved, considering the effect on other aspects of the engagement. And it also involves responding appropriately to fraud or suspected fraud, including responding to management bias, which, if intentional, is fraudulent, and considering whether any identified misstatements and any bias identified through those misstatements may be due to fraud. So this ends my quick run through those two sections of the proposed standard, and so I will hand it back to you, Diane. Thank you.
Susan, that was some heavy lifting you did. We appreciate it. All tough topics. So let me come back to something that don't go away yet. You have to come back online because I'm going to ask you a question about forward-looking statements. And obviously, some of the sustainability information could have forward-looking, could have scenario analysis, could have these what ifs could happen, not 1 year, 5 years down the road, all sorts of stuff. So I want to just revisit, is it the practitioner's responsibility to opine on the likelihood of those scenarios, the reliability of those scenarios? And I just want to circle back to ask you to reiterate, what is the auditor's responsibility relative to those forward-looking statements, both from a reasonable assurance and a limited assurance engagement?
So no. When I graduated from college, they did not hand me a diploma and a crystal ball. So the practitioner cannot opine on the likelihood of the results of forward-looking information or estimates. It's just not possible. But what the practitioner can do is consider whether or not management is appropriately applying the criteria as determined in the criteria, and selecting and using appropriate methods, assumptions, and data when developing their forward-looking information or their estimates, and doing that consistently from year to year, unless when it's not necessarily appropriate to do so. And they can test the controls around in a reasonable assurance. They can test the controls around the development of that forward-looking information. But no, the practitioner would not be required to and cannot opine on the outcome of that information.
Okay, and something else you said in there is also, it goes without saying, the practitioner's knowledge of the framework, really understanding what is intended by the disclosures and whether the company complied with the disclosures, really, really important concepts to weave throughout the whole statement, quite frankly. It's a prerequisite that you understand the criteria that the organization is using, and they could be published criteria, they could be internally developed, but you need to have a real crisp understanding as to what that is so that you could make an assessment as to whether they complied with it.
And something else that I don't know if we tapped on very heavily during this discussion, but in the proposed standard, there's a fair amount of discussion about considering whether or not the criteria is appropriate, and before accepting the engagement and in the engagement.
And that came up, a couple folks did post that and they were spot on. Early on, these types of engagements, backing the bus up and spending some extra time on that acceptance to really understand, what is the company intending to disclose? What type of framework are they using? You may want to begin to understand what type of evidence they have for their disclosures early on, because you don't want to get too far down on these engagements and then realize, we have a situation and that's probably not going to end well. So I think that there's a good amount of discussion, also application guidance focused on that acceptance process, and you're spot on that as well. One of the other topics near and dear to my heart, I was kind of a vocal relative to this topic at the board, was materiality. As auditors, we live and breathe over materiality, and there are some nuances here when you're doing these types of engagements, because you may not have one fat materiality number. You may have individual materialities based upon the types of disclosures, but that doesn't, eliminate the need to take a step back and evaluate the overall report. So can you just double down again a little bit on that, the fact that it is okay to have multiple materiality numbers. They may be different for qualitative or quantitative, or back to Dan's definitions based upon the groupings and so on.
So yes, that's true. So, as I mentioned the example about, you might have carbon dioxide emissions that comes out in measured in tons, and you may have safety violations measured in numbers of instances reported, and there's no way to think about those in an as a whole. If you're opining on the sustainability information as a whole, you're going to have two different numbers. It's maybe one instance of a safety violation is material, and so you can't compare them, you can't aggregate them. However, and this really kind of hinges to what we heard when we were hearing about how practitioners think about materiality with respect to qualitative disclosures. So in a qualitative disclosure, it's hard to say, all right, the qualitative disclosure is going to be off by this amount, because there's no amount. It's a description of a process. But when you stand back and you look at the description of the process, and you look at the process and you say, well, that's just a little bit off. I'm not sure that would influence the needs of a user, or they would make a difference to a user. So I'm not going to chalk it up to material, but it's a little bit off. But then if you have a whole bunch of them,
A little bit off.
Like a bunch of little white lies can add up to a big material misstatement overall. And so that was the way it was described to us in outreach, is that people stand back and they think overall, and then they apply to the concept of materiality to the statements kind of as a whole.
Yeah. I just wanted to point that out because it will be a little different than what your obviously your typical financial statement audit engagement. And then I'd be remiss, Susan, if I didn't ask you something about 315, one of your favorites. So in this standard, in the proposed standard, we don't go as far as to require explicitly distinguish between the concepts of inherent risk and control risk. And can you maybe just talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So we thought about it, and it's actually the separate inherent and control risk assessment is a relatively new concept even in the audit of financial statements, because up until 315 as revised in 2019, separate inherent and control risk assessment was not required. And I would argue that ISSA 5000 as proposed does not prohibit it. So a practitioner could, if they wanted to assess separate inherent and control risks, they could and be in full compliance with ISSA 5000 as exposed. However, we did hear a lot about the state of controls in this space right now and how a lot of entities don't have well-developed controls, and to try to tease out inherent and separate inherent and control risk assessments would be challenging. So we just focused on risk as combined. But as I said, a practitioner could, if it was helpful to think of it that way, be more than welcome to do that.
Very helpful, very helpful. Okay, so now we're going to move ahead. We're going to talk now about misstatements, other information, communication, and reporting. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Claire, to take us through these areas. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Diane. Yes, so when you've done all that work that Susan was talking about, I'm going to talk about then evaluating any misstatements that you've identified and including misstatements in the subject matter and in the other information. So with respect to evaluating misstatements, the practitioner is focused primarily, of course, on identifying material misstatements, whether due to fraud or error in the sustainability information, subject to the assurance engagement. However, in order for the practitioner not to be associated with misleading information, they also need to consider other information that the sustainability information, subject to their assurance engagement, is reported with. And I'll come back to that second point. So ED 5000 addresses the practitioner's responsibility with respect to evaluating both of these types of material misstatements. In developing the requirements for the evaluation of material misstatements in the sustainability information itself, and also in the other information, the IAASB did look at ISA 3000, ISA 3410, as well as the EER guidance as a starting point. As with determining or considering materiality, key challenges in evaluating misstatements in sustainability assurance engagements are qualitative information and information that is of a dissimilar nature. And Susan talked quite a bit about that. Those that cannot be readily accumulated. The IAASB have included application material to explain considerations in accumulating and evaluating misstatements for qualitative disclosures. Much of this material we have adapted from the EER guidance, that non-authoritative guidance. We've also got some application material in ED 5000 in aggregating misstatements when they relate to aspects of topics or topics themselves that are not comparable. And the IAASB also looked at the auditing standards in this regard for how qualitative and quantitative misstatements are described. So in considering the level at which misstatements should be evaluated, ED 5000 requires a practitioner to evaluate misstatements for each disclosure or for the disclosures in aggregate. So it depends on the circumstances of the engagement. So for example, for disclosures, in performing procedures on the disclosure for work-related injuries, the practitioner identifies more than one misstatement. The practitioner determines whether the disclosure work-related injuries is materially misstated by evaluating the individual or combined effect of those misstatements on that disclosure. Or, in contrast, for disclosures in aggregate, the practitioner may be providing a conclusion in the assurance report on whether the sustainability information related to occupational health and safety is prepared in all material respects in accordance with the applicable criteria. Accordingly, the practitioner determines whether all of the misstatements related to the topic of occupational health and safety, including those relating to work-related injuries, are material. So looks at them in aggregate. With respect to other information, the practitioner is required to consider misstatements in other information under ED 5000. It's not to say that they do additional work in that regard, however, because their primary responsibility, obviously, is assuring the sustainability information subject to the engagement. Other information, just to clarify, is the information included in a document or documents containing the sustainability information subject to the engagement and the assurance report. The concept of other information is particularly important in the context of sustainability assurance engagements, as there's a risk that the sustainability information may be reported with other information that is inconsistent with the sustainability information assured. An understanding of the impact of the sustainability matters may not be well understood across the organisation, that is the entity being assured. Sustainability information may also be presented together with the entity's audited financial statements or part of the entity's annual report or in a separate document or documents accompanying the annual report. In these circumstances, the audited financial statements are considered other information for the purposes of ED 5000. However, the requirements are for the practitioner to read and consider the other information. Just that other information that is available prior to the date of the assurance report. The IAASB did consider that it would be too onerous to require the practitioner to obtain and consider other information not available at the date of the assurance report. So that is required in the auditing standards for listed entities, but certainly for the broader overarching standard that is ED 5000, we didn't think, the IAASB didn't think that that was appropriate. However, it doesn't preclude the practitioner from considering that information obtained later, particularly if they come across information that contradicts or appears to be misstated. So what if there is a misstatement that the practitioner detects in that other information? So a misstatement of other information would exist if the other information is incorrectly stated or misleading. So if it omits or obscures information necessary for the proper understanding of a matter disclosed in that information. As with other misstatements, the practitioner will ask management to correct any of those material misstatements identified. Next slide, please, Michelle. So having touched on misstatements and the assessment of those misstatements, I wanted to move on to communication with those charged with governance and also the reporting. So in ED 5000, communication with management, those charged with governance and others is pitched at a very high level. That said, it's a very principle-based requirement. Essentially, the requirement is that the practitioner determine whether any significant matters have come to the attention of the practitioner, which should be communicated to management, those charged with governance or others. However, this is explained in a lot more detail in the application material, which provides examples of significant matters that may be appropriate to communicate. And some of those are listed on this slide. So the identification of suspected fraud or non-compliance with laws and regulations, deficiencies in internal control, management bias, and uncorrected material misstatements that I was just speaking about. So the IAASB did consider whether ED 5000 should address these communications with those charged with governance in greater detail. However, they noted that the requirement in 5000 is consistent with ISSA 3000 and also reflects the evolving nature of sustainability assurance engagements and the different topics, aspects of topics that might be disclosed by the entity. So the IAASB concluded that this principle-based requirement is appropriate and that the detail provided in the application material is sufficient. However, we are interested in your feedback and whether more specific communication requirements are needed, and welcome your feedback on that, and what types of matters that might need to be communicated or might be required to be communicated, because of course the requirements don't preclude further communication as needed by the practitioner. So with respect to the reporting requirements and the contents of the assurance report, the 5,000, whilst the reporting requirements were largely or initially based on ISA 3000, 3410, and drew very much on the EER guidance, the IAASB has also, recently completed the audit reporting post-implementation review, and which indicated that demand from stakeholders to consider changes to the assurance report for other engagements to align with the auditor's report on on audits of financial statements. So we very much listened to that feedback and took the approach of providing consistency across the assurance and auditors reporting to the extent that was possible. And this is expected to then be able to be read alongside the auditor's report and be more easily comparable. The IAASB considered that in order to provide a global baseline, this comparability would be really important to the users and readers of the assurance report. So the IAASB considered the latest thinking in reporting, and those are reflected in the auditing standards, and incorporated the elements that were relevant to reporting on sustainability assurance engagements into the requirements of ED 5000. As well, I'd also flag the Appendix 2, which contains illustrative assurance reports. So in particular, the IAASB considered relevant requirements in the auditing standards that could apply for sustainability assurance engagements, or could be applied, ordering of the contents elements of the assurance report with the conclusion or opinion first, including statements about independence and other ethical responsibilities, including the engagement leader's name for listed entities only. And that's one of the few requirements that is dependent on being a listed entity. And a separate section for other information that we talked about, the misstatements of other information earlier. The IAASB also aligned the approach to modifications in ED 5000 with the auditing standards, as well as the approach to emphasis of matter and other matter paragraphs, so that there will be consistent reporting under those of those matters, which would make that much more understandable for users familiar with reading auditors' reports of financial statements. I also note that members of our reference group, or reference groups, because we have two reference groups in relation to sustainability assurance, also notice that there's a heightened need for communication by the assurance practitioner in the report to meet the information needs of intended users. Obviously, this reporting environment is evolving and maturing, and reinforces the need for long form reporting in many cases. Now, whilst we haven't illustrated in Appendix 2 that I mentioned a long form report, certainly the standard contemplates and allows for that. And we illustrated only the basic content elements in the illustrative reports, in essence, to avoid confusion and to be absolutely clear on what was mandatory rather than optional additional matters to be included in that report. So the final matter that I wanted to touch on in relation to assurance reports is key audit matters. And certainly during development of the exposure draft, we were asked a lot about and talked a lot about key audit matters and whether they would be applicable under this standard. So in considering the need for those key audit matters, the board did acknowledge that there's a potential public interest benefit in communicating such matters, or the assurance equivalent, perhaps key assurance or sustainability assurance matters. However, the board considered that the outcome, the board considered the outcome of the auditor's reporting post-implementation review that I mentioned earlier, and found that respondents had not been supportive of communicating key audit matters for other assurance reports. And the board noted that CAM are currently required only for audits, so reasonable assurance engagements, whereas ISSA 5000 covers limited assurance engagements as well for listed entities. And again, the board was keen not to include too many requirements that were predicated on certain circumstances. So conditional requirements, we tried to minimize those as far as possible. So considering that key audit matters would only apply to a small group, if you like, or just a discrete group of the engagements that are intended to be conducted over this standard, and which may incidentally include very narrow scope engagements for which key audit matters would not be appropriate, or key assurance matters would not be appropriate. The IAASB decided to leave consideration of such matters to potential for further standards, further standard setting activity in the future. So now I want to hand back to you, Diane.
Wonderful. Thank you, Claire. Thank you. So a couple things. Let's start off with, I have a couple ideas, questions on other information. First and foremost, and folks who have done these types of engagements may have stumbled across this, but sometimes that other information includes a whole bunch of different things. It could include, information in a financial statement situation, management discussion analysis, could be a separate sustainability report. It could be different types of press releases, what have you, different types of reporting. So how do people understand, how does the assurance professional get their arms around what is the other information that they've got to pull into their engagement? And I was bold. I was going to suggest that I would go back to the definitions, to the Master Dan, and reaffirm what is sustainability information and what is subject, and then basically understand for management, what are they considering part of the population. But I want to, Claire, correct me if I've gone wrong here.
Mm-hmm. No, not at all. So look, Diane, in response to the situation that you presented, which is going to be a very common situation where there's a lot of other information. There's subject to the practitioner having obtained that information by the time they're signing off their report. There's an entire annual report, and maybe the practitioner, doesn't have particular knowledge about, financial information and so forth. The requirement is restricted to inconsistencies between the information in that other information and the sustainability information that the practitioner has assured. So it's not that they have to go away and do another engagement across all of that other information. That's not their responsibility at all. It's to, for example, in a very narrow scope engagement, it's only that particular matter that they will be looking for in that other information to see if it's referenced in some way, to determine if there's inconsistencies, that material inconsistencies that might indicate misstatements. So they're looking for inconsistencies between the other information, sustainability information, and they're also looking for inconsistencies with that other information, with the knowledge that they've gathered. So of course their knowledge of the client can be, quite rich, and there may be other things that might not be strictly the sustainability information that raises a red flag for them, and then they need to pursue. And they are also required to, remain alert for indications of information, as I said, that's not related at all to the sustainability information, but they're just from their own knowledge aware that might be misstated. So it's very much in the context of the engagement that they've conducted.
Again, coming back to, first of all, understanding what is the population of that other information, and then emphasizing that you don't need to be an expert. You're focusing on the inconsistencies. Gotcha. Okay. Second question. I know, obviously in ISSA 5000, we've included some illustrative reports. Is there a plan to provide further illustrations down the road and further examples as we get more, some of these reports, eventually the standard gets issued, we start getting some more of these reports out there in the public? Is that the plan, to issue further illustrations down the road?
Yeah, thanks, Diane. So currently our future work plan, is being considered, and we've had a consultation on that, and we'll certainly consider those implementation guidance next year when we issue the standard. But in the meantime, the EER guidance does provide actually a lot of illustrative reports, and is a useful. Now, whilst the format of those reports is not entirely consistent with the new format, if I can put it that way, of the illustrations in ED 5000. The material within those practitioners should find very, very useful. So further illustrations on top of that will be a matter down the track for our work program. Great.
Thanks so much. So I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank Tom for kicking us off, Dan, Susan, and Claire. And as I mentioned early on, I do want to round back and just cover off our outreach before we part ways. So Michelle, if you don't mind just moving us forward. One more slide, please. Thanks so much. So as I obviously, given the importance of this topic and the time that we've spent here today, this slide does a nice job of outlining the various mechanisms that are being used to discuss the standard and solicit feedback. This is a global outreach plan and includes such things as our webinar today, face-to-face roundtables, presentations at regional events, and so on. And you'll probably recognize from today's discussion, when you reflect upon it, that there's a lot of elements to these assurance engagements that really need to be thought through. So collecting feedback on the proposal is essential to making it fit for purpose. I'd also like, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the comment letter period is open. It is open to December 1st. So encourage folks to respond that way. We've had a number of folks ask us about the slides. They will be posted and available so that you can reflect on them. We also taped this presentation. So those of you who are interested in watching the tape, it'll be available on YouTube. So you again can look at that, share with some of your colleagues. But really appreciate everybody's attendance. Again, many thanks to the panelists for providing the insights and taking us through some of the deeper concepts within this, and look forward to continue to work on this project. So thanks very much for attending. I hope this was meaningful and responsive to folks, and have a great rest of your day. Take care.